Hey guys, happy Monday. About 3 weeks left to go, so you're doing good. Keep it up. Um, I know we had talked about doing Australia and New Zealand, but I decided I wanted to do something that you would have textbook information for, just in case you needed to fall back on something. And so I'm going to throw you a big curveball here, actually. I decided that I'm going to fast forward and talk about a world event that is not ancient at all, but I think shapes culture significantly, and that is World War One. Um, this is something I didn't get to in modern world history this year at all, first or second semester, and so I think that there are people who took modern world history last semester and we didn't get to it, and I wished we had. And I think it's such a significant event that I thought it'd be worth our time these last 3 weeks to talk about World War One and maybe get into some of the implications, because I actually think they have a lot to say about what we're going through today too. I hope that's okay with you. If it's not, you can shoot me a message, but I'm not sure um, that we'll be able to accommodate everybody in this late in the game. But anyway, what I want to talk about today is the causes of World War One. It's one of the big questions that comes out of the war, because there's so much devastation that is connected and associated with the war. But when you look back, you say, well, why did we fight that war? Um, you might say almost nothing is gained and a great deal is lost in fighting this war. Now, certainly there's a huge impact, but in terms of gain, um, there wasn't like injustice that was being reversed. There's no um, oppressed group of people that are being liberated. It's just devastation. So we have to really think about the causes of the war so that we can understand how they came to be fighting such a war that doesn't have clear cut issues that lead up to it. So we're going to take a look at this list here. And these causes are what I like to call atmospheric causes, meaning it's just the way the atmosphere was, especially in Europe, in the early part of the 20th century. These things were just sort of in the air, and if you add them all together, it became, well, pretty combustible. And then the thing that lights the match, so to speak, or sparks the war, is this assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And I'm pretty confident you've heard about that before. We'll tell the story tomorrow. It's a interesting story, and then heartbreaking, and then of course tragic in that it is loss of life and leads into this terrible war. But most of what leads into the war is this sort of atmospheric, these things that are sort of pieces of the puzzle, but on their own would never have led to such a massive war. And the thing that's sort of interesting and almost surprising about that is that it comes off of a real sense of optimism. In the late 1800s, going into the 1900s, the modern West was very, very confident and very, very optimistic that they were leaving behind some of the bigger issues of society, and they thought war was one of them. Eventually, they started to think of World War One as sort of the war to end all wars, believing that maybe this was the war out of which they could arrange the peace so that they would never fight another war. But of course, that turned out to be false optimism. But what I want to do is sort of give you a sense of the pieces of the puzzle today, and then tomorrow I'll tell the story of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and maybe get into the actual beginning of the war. The first piece of the puzzle is what we might call nationalism. Now, I don't want you to associate this with simply the sense of like patriotism or love of your country. This is more than that. This kind of nationalism comes with a really aggressive kind of foreign policy, which is sometimes called jingoism. That's not a word people use very often, but in scenarios like this, it's useful because it gives us a sense of the more acute kind of nationalism that we're talking about. Jingoism was really aggressive foreign policy that basically said that your country is more valuable over and against other countries, and whatever you have to do to those countries in order to benefit your own country is okay. It actually lends itself to what we would call social Darwinism. Now, I'm sure you know who Charles Darwin was, and I'm sure you know a little bit about evolution. But of course, a part of this story of evolution is this phrase that many people use, which is basically the survival of the fittest. That's the engine of evolution. That the more fit survive, and so then the next generation will have the attributes of the more fit organisms, and so forth and so on. That's actually not a phrase Darwin used, survival of the fittest, but it's apt, so we'll use it. What's really tragic is that besides there being the scientific theory of evolution, is that many people in the late 1800s, early 1900s began to apply it to society. And they began to say, well, there's certain societies that are more highly evolved. Those are the societies that should survive, and the others should go by the wayside. That if the strong can dominate the weak, the strong should dominate the weak. There were even people who said, listen, with healthcare getting better and there not being so many wars, and with life expectancy getting better, all these weak people are surviving, and they're propagating their genes, and their attributes are going on to the next generation. So there were people, and many of them in Europe, were actually advocating for war because they said, we want to do away with the weaker people. And they think a war will do that. And that is setting the stage, of course, for a really sort of tense suspicion of each other. Some of the rhetoric that's coming up out of this nationalism is actually violent rhetoric. The next thing that we need to understand is that rhetoric didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't out of nowhere. It was attached to these pre-existing rivalries. That is to say, these countries that were jingoistic towards one another had been really rivals for a long time. France and Germany had been rivals for really generations. And so them being next door neighbors, this nationalism and these pre-existing rivalries led people to have a real sense of fear and know, if they could trust their neighbors. And that lack of trust, because of their pre-existing rivalries, because of the way that Europe had been fighting against one another for generations, and because of this new hyper-nationalism, led people to say, well, we need to build up our militaries. And of course, that's connected to the Industrial Revolution too. The ability to build up militaries was unprecedented. And so these countries, even in times of peace, countries like France and England and Germany and Austria, were building up their militaries to unprecedented levels, even though they weren't at war, and developing new weapons. One of the big storylines in World War I is these new weapons. Machine gun and airplane and zeppelins and flamethrowers and all kinds of terrible ways to kill one another. And so with that, what we end up seeing is these massive militaries leading people to say, wow, I really do have a reason to be afraid of Germany. Look, they're developing these submarines, and look, they have all kinds of new weapons, and their army is bigger than it's ever been. And that kind of thing led to people saying, well, I need to make sure I have an ally in case war breaks out. I need to make sure that I have, people and countries that will help me if war really does break out. And so the map, and we'll look at a map tomorrow, starts to really kind of take shape with these certain alliances. There's two major alliances, and we'll look at them tomorrow, but one's called the Central Powers. That's Germany and Austria-Hungary, and initially Italy, although Italy will switch sides, and that'll bring in the Ottoman Empire, Turkey. And then there's what we might call the Triple Entente, or a lot of times just call them the Allies. And initially that was Russia, France, and England. And so these alliances started to have really kind of long tentacles, because some of the smaller countries got involved in these major alliances. And so the dominoes were sort of set up. And these dominoes were pretty fragile because of how extensive the alliance systems were. Any one domino falls and, well, really, the whole thing could come apart. And that's what we see with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. We see an assassination that knocks over a domino that in maybe normal circumstances would have been a single domino, and these two groups of people would have found a way to bring justice and there wouldn't have been war. But because of the alliances, this single assassination, which actually leads to the death of actually two people, but this assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand sets these wheels in motion, and the alliances are mobilized, and war starts just a few short months later. And a lot of this is just all connected to the way that the tension had been building through this extreme nationalism, these pre-existing rivalries, the buildup of militaries in peacetime, and these alliances that have been set up. So these are the five major causes. We could actually break it down maybe a little bit further, but this is a good sense of the atmosphere that led to World War I. So tomorrow my goal will be to show you the alliances and talk about the story of Franz Ferdinand, and then try to understand how the war began, the first phase of the war. I hope you have a great Monday. It's great weather outside. Make sure you get outside. Maybe go for a walk or get some sunshine. And I'll see you tomorrow.